Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Joanne Starks of SEDL in Austin, Texas, and I'll be moderating today's webcast entitled Assessment of the Quality and Applicability of Systematic Reviews, or AQASR. I also want to thank my colleague Ann Williams for her logistical and technical support for today's webcast. The webcast is offered through the Center on Knowledge Translation for Disability and Rehabilitation Research, or KTDRR, which is funded by the National Institute on Disability and Rehabilitation Research. This webcast provides a brief overview of the topic of systematic reviews and introduces a document and checklist designed to help busy clinicians, administrators, and researchers to identify the strengths and weaknesses of a systematic review in general and as relevant to their own specific needs. Following this webcast, our presenter, Dr. Marcel Dijkers, will be leading an online workshop over several weeks that will present this material in detail so participants can learn to apply the AQASR tool. It's now my pleasure to introduce Marcel Dijkers, PhD, FACRM, who is research professor in the Department of Rehabilitation Medicine and senior investigator in the Brain Injury Research Center at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. Dr. Dijkers is director of the NIDER-funded Disability and Rehabilitation Research Project on classification and measurement of medical rehabilitation interventions, as well as the Mount Sinai Advanced Rehabilitation Research Training Project. He is also senior investigator for the New York TBI model system funded by NIDER. Dr. Dijkers has published more than 120 articles and chapters on the social and functional consequences of SCI-TBI, the delivery of health services for these conditions, outcome measurement, and methodological and statistical issues in rehabilitation research. I also want to mention that he worked with us in our previous NCDDR project funded by NIDER as the facilitator of a task force on systematic review and guidelines. Now, let me hand it over to Dr. Dijkers.
Thank you, Joanne. We indeed will be talking about assessing the quality and applicability of systematic reviews, and very specifically about the instruments with the difficult name AQASR, which was together by the task force to help people evaluating whether a particular systematic review was relevant to their clinical questions and whether the review had enough quality that its conclusions and findings could be trusted. So the objectives on slide 2 are to quickly go over the steps and issues in the development of systematic reviews. And I'm doing this mostly for those among the audience who may have heard about what a systematic review is, may have read a few, but are not really aware of all the steps that go into the creation of a good systematic review. Then we'll introduce the AQASR by looking at a number of the questions that are included in this instrument, and specifically we'll talk about how use of this instrument might be able to might help people to decide, as I indicated, whether to use a particular instrument. If we go to slide 4, if you go to Medline, which is maintained by the National Library of Medicine, you will find a definition of review as an article or book published after examination of published material on a subject. And we're all very much aware of, in our professional literature, reviews being published on a regular basis, and they range all the way from more or less opinion pieces where somebody discusses 6 or 10 previous papers and gives their opinion what's the best thing to do, to much more systematic and careful things. So indicated here, review may be comprehensive to various degrees, and the time range of the material scrutinized may be broad or narrow, but most often desired, of course, is reviews of the current literature. The textual material examined may be equally broad and can encompass in medicine specifically, and of course, remember this comes from the National Library of Medicine, clinical material as well as experimental research or case reports. So, this still doesn't tell us what a systematic review is. The AQASR comes packaged with a glossary, and the glossary gives a definition of a systematic review, synthesizes research evidence focused on a particular question, and follows an a priori protocol to systematically find primary studies, assess them for quality, extract relevant information, and synthesize it qualitatively or quantitatively. And when it's quantitatively, we call that a meta-analysis. The glossary also indicates that systematic reviews reduce bias in the review process and improve the dependability of the answer to the question through the use of a protocol, through systematic electronic and manual literature searches, and careful extracting of the data and critical appraisal of individual studies. And I think, here's the key to the difference between a systematic review and most reviews out there in the literature that are not systematic. The reducing of bias, the making sure that all relevant research information is carefully looked at before you come to a conclusion as to what the research shows or not. Slide number 4 gives you a fairly complex overview of what's going on in a systematic review. We could start in the right lower hand corner, the green box with focused clinical questions. That's where the people who create a systematic review start off. They say, have questions like, what's the best way of diagnosing disease X? Or what's the best way of treating disorder Y? Or what can we say about the prognosis over a 10-year time span after a first diagnosis of a particular disorder? In order to answer that question, one ought to develop a systematic review protocol. And from a number of points of view, systematic review is a research project, and nobody would do a research project without having a protocol first. So the protocol will specify the key steps, and those are the boxes in blue, the supplemental steps, which are the boxes in yellow, and it will specify the instruments that will be used, and those are the white boxes at the bottom. So if we start walking this path, very often the first step is to have the systematic review protocol peer-reviewed by a group of experts to make sure that the plan is watertight as it can be. Then the first step is to search the bibliographic databases, whether that's Medline or Cinehill or PsycInfo. Nowadays you can also search the registers of ongoing studies, and that might be a useful search. You can search particular websites where people publish systematic review or articles in a particular area, like the Pedro database out of Australia. All of those can be searched, and the results based on the inclusion-exclusion criteria, the keywords that you provide, will be a set of abstracts from hundreds to thousands of abstracts that are potentially relevant to this research question. The next step is to scan these abstracts and pick out, based on the content, a set of full papers that are certainly or likely or even possibly relevant to the question, but you can't tell from the abstract. So of course the next step then is to look at these full papers, get copies of them through interlibrary loan or other sources, scan the paper using a set of fairly specific criteria, and determine which one ought to be included or excluded. Yes, the next slide shows you more or less graphically how this works. In blue is the data, quote unquote, that the systematic review needs. On the very left is the entire bibliographic database. If you realize that I think Medline at the moment is at 7 million papers, you know that this is a big stack of material. The first step to go through that is to use the keywords, the mesh terms and what have you, to come to a smaller stack of the abstracts of potential applicable studies. Those then, with more specific inclusion-exclusion criteria, then can be used in a bibliographic database search. I looked at to find the papers that are likely to be applicable. Ideally, the search of the reading of the abstract is done by 2 or more people independently, so that the chance of missing something is reduced. Then the next step, the full text of likely applicable studies needs to be read, again ideally by 2 people who now can even apply even more detail to determine whether these papers need to be put into the systematic review as applicable studies. Now, very generally, people not just collect the relevant research, but also evaluate how well it was done, using a checklist, a rating scale, and what have you. Sometimes on the basis of that rating of the quality of the research, papers are deleted from the stack as having too low quality. Other systematic reviewers will not necessarily eliminate weak papers, but will consider them less important, give them less weight in drawing conclusions. I'm going to go forward to the next slide, which repeats the slide number 4. In the middle there, the blue box, is the quality assessment of the papers that I just talked about. The next step is data extracting, where based on a set of instructions and a form, all the relevant information relevant to the question is extracted from the papers. Generally, it goes into an Excel spreadsheet or something similar, so that it's easier to synthesize stuff in the next step. And the synthesis can be more qualitative, or it can be very quantitative, as I mentioned, the meta-analysis. Once that has happened, the next step is to draw the conclusions and make recommendations. And here I can tie back in with the maybe very first box at the bottom left in the orangey color, which is the reader's needs, his or her own questions, his or her patients or clients' characteristics, needs, and values. As a potential consumer of a systematic reviewer, your first question always is, will this systematic review answer my questions? And that's an issue of evaluating the match between the reader's needs and the focused clinical question that the systematic reviewer started off with, which presumably would have led to conclusions with respect to that clinical question that would be the bottom line for the potential reviewers. So let me mention quickly some of the what I call supplementary steps that is in the yellow boxes. Sometimes we systematic reviewers will contact experts in the area of the systematic review and say, we did database scanning, we looked at abstracts, and here is the list of 40 articles that we think we should include. Are you aware of anything else that is out there for some reason or another, didn't show up in the bibliographic databases that we ought to look at? Ancestor searching is, once you have full papers, we always refer to our ancestors, research that was done previously. So by scanning the references in the full articles we have, we again may be able to identify some papers that for some reason or other escaped us. Journal hand searching is sometimes done when people are worried that the electronic databases, bibliographic databases, may have skipped certain journals, may have skipped certain articles, and people will indeed go to bound volumes of a journal that is very much relevant to the clinical question and go year by year, article by article, to see whether there's something out there. Lastly, communicating with study authors, whether you are in the phase of quality assessment or data extracting. Very often systematic reviewers find that the paper doesn't necessarily give all the information on the study that the reviewer would like to have. And one way to resolve that question is to send an email or a snail mail letter to the authors and say, ask the questions. You say that you randomized subjects to a treatment group and a control group. Was the randomization allocation hidden from people when they gave their informed consent and when they had a baseline assessment of their qualifications and their needs. It's an important question to ask, whether there was really concealment or not, and the study authors, of course, know, but for some reason they not always put it into their written papers. I already mentioned in the beginning peer review of the protocol. Sometimes people also submit their draft report on the systematic review to peer reviewers to let them judge whether they indeed didn't skip any major research or didn't misinterpret some of the research that the peer reviewer experts may be aware of. So this for a quite short overview of the systematic reviewing steps. Now, where does the AQASR come in? As Joanne mentioned in the beginning, CEDL in 2006 and 11 for its National Center of Dissemination of Rehabilitation Research convened a task force on systematic reviews and guidelines, which, as she mentioned, I chaired. And this task force was to consider various issues relevant to the production and use of systematic reviews and guidelines, especially as it was relevant to clinicians, researchers, policymakers in disability and rehabilitation services, and with a focus on the NIDRR grantees. The task force created some papers, presented webcast, made conference presentations, but next slide, its major product on which we probably spent close to 3 years was the AQASR, the Assessing the Quality and Applicability of Systematic Reviews, that at the time didn't get that name yet. We used to talk about the guidelines, but more recently we revised it, and as it shows on the bottom of this slide, it's now under its new name with some edits available on the website of the current Knowledge Translation Dissemination Research Center of CEDL. What's in the AQASR? It's more than just a checklist. It provides you an introduction to systematic reviews, more or less the information that I just gave apropos of those 3 slides. The checklist itself is subdivided in a number of sections, and we'll get there, and each section has an introduction. Then within each section there is a number of questions to ask, and as a help for the people who want to use the checklist, we provide information on where to look in a systematic review for the type of information that is relevant to coming up with an answer for the checklist, and check, yes, this is done, no, this wasn't done, yes, this was done well, no, it wasn't done well. And in each instance, it also provides the rationale for why this particular question is important. Lastly, and for this reason, the document may be worth your while, there is a glossary that addresses about any and all questions that you might have with respect to technical terms of systematic reviewing. As I mentioned, published originally 2011 and recently republished. I am going on to slide number 9. Why did we create this? Well, probably everybody who ever will listen to this webcast is aware that the scientific and professional literature keeps on growing, and if you want to have any hope to keep up with what's happening, you probably will need to rely to a degree on systematic reviews. The problem is many people were never trained in systematic reviewing because this was a scientific methodology that was developed after they left school, or it was never taught in their undergraduate or graduate programs on research methodology, so they don't know what it is. And out there, there is information available on how to do a systematic review, but not necessarily much on how to look at the quality of a review and the applicability of a review. So that was our basic purpose in developing the checklist, is to help busy clinicians, administrators, and researchers to ask the critical questions that will help reveal the strengths and weaknesses of a particular review in general, and more specifically as it's relevant to their research question or questions. So how did we create a checklist? I'm on slide 10. We mined the existing literature on the quality of systematic reviews for items. We looked at the books and papers on how to do a systematic review. We sorted all those items into categories, not necessarily the same ones that you'll see in a few minutes. And we discussed them in task force meetings from a number of viewpoints. This item really addressed the quality of a review. Can you find the answer by just reading the review at hand? If I ask a question, does this review cover all the literature with respect to a particular area? Really, you can only answer that question when you know all the literature relevant to the particular area or question. Well, that would mean that you would have to do a lot more study. So questions like that cannot be answered by just reading the review in question, we tended to throw out. Then, of course, we asked the question, is it important to ask this question? And lastly, does it help the users of the checklist to better understand the strengths and limitations of the review at hand, and in the end assist them to make better decisions on using it or not using it? So next we discarded items, combined items, split some items, and when we had a final set of questions, we wrote the respective look for sections and the rationale, why this is an important question sections. And while doing that, we wrote the glossary, and most of the introduction came at the very end. I want you to be aware that what the AQASR is a checklist, not a rating scale. It's not that you can put in every box on the checklist and code 0 for not done or not done well, or 1 for done well, and add them up and say, now I have a quantitative number that indicates the quality of the review. That's not what we were after. We develop this thing to help people think critically about a review. And you can very well imagine that a review is extremely well done, but for instance, the question on is it relevant to my question is no. Well, this review still should have a high score, but it's not relevant to you. So we tend to tell people, don't go blindly on a score. Use the questions to understand the systematic review that you're reading and that you want to be applying if you find that it's any good. So how would a review user use the checklist? Of course, first you have to have a clinical question. How do I treat my patient? How do I assess this client? What's the best way? What do I tell people when they ask me for a prognosis? That kind of questions. Specifically determine your own need, the values, etc. It doesn't make sense to read a systematic review on a pharmacological intervention when the patient you are treating has refused to take any drugs. Then you need to search for systematic reviews that have been published with respect to your question. Determine the correspondence between your own needs and the focused questions or question that the review addresses. And here is the applicability focus of AQASR. Then you need to assess the quality of the systematic review, and here comes in the quality focus. And if you decide that this particular systematic review had the correspondence and the quality, you can take the next step by applying the findings, the recommendations in your own practice. I'm going to slide 14. AQASR has questions on the steps that all systematic reviews have in common. The focused clinical question, the systematic review protocol, the searches of the literature, the scanning of the abstracts, and then the scanning of the full papers, the assessment of the quality of the primary studies, the extracting of the data, the synthesizing of the data qualitatively, drawing conclusions, making recommendations, and the quantitative synthesis is optional and only makes sense if you have data of a particular nature, so that here is listed slightly off to the side. Then depending on what the clinical question is, there is a set of specific questions. So if you have a question that deals with prevention or intervention, AQASR suggests 13 additional questions. Diagnostic procedures, 8 questions. Measurement instruments, 10 questions. Making a prognosis, 6 questions. Economic evaluation, what's the expense of a particular clinical management strategy, particular intervention, 7 questions. So let's take a look at the sampling of the AQASR questions. And on page 17, the systematic review question, the clinical applicability, we came up with 6 questions. On page 18, you see that the first question is, do the authors ask a concrete, concise, clearly stated question as the basis for their review? And we suggest that you look for, well, do they offer you a question and a conceptual framework that leads to that question, that indicates why it is an important question? Do they define the terms stated in the question? Do they specify the population, the settings, the conditions of interest, the providers, the clinicians, and the outcomes? It's very nice to read a systematic review on the treatment of major depressive disorder in people with spinal cord injury, but it may or may not be applicable to people with traumatic brain injury. So you may want to look for, well, do they deal with the same patient population that I deal with, or at least do they mention it or have a subsection for my population so that it's more likely that what they find and recommend will be of use to me. I'll skip the last one. That's relevant only to situations where the systematic reviewers changed course halfway. So the next slide provides some of the background. Why is this so important? And I already referred to that to some degree. If the question is too broad, if the findings lack sufficient relevance for answering your particular clinical questions or for formulating your future research questions, the review is not going to be very helpful. And clinically focused review is most useful and relevant if it addresses an issue that's important and that informs decision-making around management for specific situations and specific types of persons. You can't always find a systematic review that is that specific, let alone a good systematic review that is that specific, but it's worthwhile looking for. I go on to the next slide, introductory to protocols, of which we have 5 questions. The first one, was there an a priori protocol for the systematic review produced, and is it available? Could you at least in principle send a way for it? And the question indicates that sometimes people develop a protocol from scratch. In other instances, professional organizations have developed more or less a template on how they would like people to do a systematic review of questions relevant to the patients or disorders or what have you of this professional organization. So in that case, you can take the template, do some fill-in, and there you have a protocol. So you can look for, does it mention that? Especially, was it written before study start in its entirety? And is it still available so that if you would want to, you could look at what was the original and did the authors follow it? Why is this important? Well, like with primary research, if you have a good plan to go about your research, you probably will come out with better answers than if you have a half-baked plan that you change 4 times every time you find a problem on your route. Questions on information retrieval, database searching. On page 24, question 1 in this section, was the method for locating evidence described? I think I made clear that systematic reviewers should be very much intent on making sure that to the degree possible they find all the primary research in a particular area that was ever published. And just a quick and dirty search in Cinehill will not do it. Yeah, you probably have to search at least 3 different databases, if not more. You may need to search the gray literature. You may have to add the hand searching of journals that I mentioned, correspond with experts, do ancestry searches, and there is also a way to look for descendants using the Web of Science. So these are all possible ways of finding the literature, and while you have to be very rich as a systematic reviewer to do, say, hand-searching journals, it's certainly worthwhile for you as a potential user to look at what was reported in terms of searching for literature, and does that look to be sufficient. So if you go to 25, there it says you cannot evaluate whether the conclusions are built on a rock or on sand without knowing in the first place how wide a web was cast to find studies. And as it's indicated here, the other questions that we have in this section are about specifics of where and how to look for evidence. But I go on to the search limitations. And with search limitations, we refer to a priori or post hoc limitations that people may do of the literature. And that may be very often the language. Most systematic reviews being published are limited to English. A few are limited to some Western languages, including English. There are very few that will take on every language in the world, because if it was published in Chinese and none of the systematic reviewers knows Chinese, you have to pay for a translation. And that, of course, makes it for very expensive. But as a user, you have to evaluate, well, does it make sense to leave out what is being published in German and in French and in Italian, or maybe in Japanese or Spanish with respect to this particular question. And on page 28, there's the explanation that I just gave. There's other questions, limitations, the time, and there's a bunch of others. So I move on to slide 30, abstract and full paper scanning, where we have 8 questions in AQASR. The first one is, did the authors provide you with the inclusion and exclusion criteria? And were these inclusion and exclusion criteria likely to result in clinically relevant articles being identified? Or were they, especially the danger is, were they too narrow? Did they omit certain key terms, which would mean that they, quite possible, never found specific terms? So on slide 32, it indicates what specifically to look for, limitations, inclusion, exclusion criteria that were used in looking at abstracts in terms of the conditions, the diagnoses, the demographic characteristics, the research designs, other methodological terms, like the word prognosis or prognosticating, and then the key constructs of interest, whether that's return to work or depressive diagnosis or what have you, what's the construct and what are the alternative terms. And then sometimes, the time frame for outcomes is interesting. We don't care, whether a treatment was successful, 2 months after treatment ended. We want to know whether it was still successful 2 years later. So you can look for the time periods that the authors described, geographic regions, if they limited not by language but by, say, healthcare systems that use fee-for-service, or healthcare systems that are national health service type. Languages, I mentioned, research designs of studies. I already talked about quality of the primary studies. The research design, of course, is very often a major determinant of quality of evidence, and then the characteristics of the subjects. Why is this important? Well, it will give you a clear understanding of what you will find in the review, what is included in terms of people, places, disorders, interventions, and what is excluded. Whether you are interested in reading about an intervention, diagnosis, prognosis, etc. A second rationale, or an additional rationale, I indicated, we generally do identifying papers in 3 steps. One is bibliographic database searches, that's using very crude mechanisms. Then we go abstract reading, where we can be more specific. And the third phase is reading the full papers that seem relevant, and only there we can be very specific. And having good, explicit inclusion, exclusion criteria in the abstracts phase, preferably ones that are a little bit on the conservative sides, is a good thing, because you always have the full paper reading stage where you can eliminate them if the abstract was misleading or uninformative. I mentioned several times methodological quality assessments and use, for which we have 6 questions. One of them is provided on slide 37. Did, in the first place, the reviewers look for methodological quality, or did they just throw into the mix anything and everything they found? So if they did quality of primary studies review, they should have a list of criteria used. If they have an evidence table that overviews the papers, they probably would have a quality grade in that table. There's various giveaways that would suggest to you that the authors indeed created quality ratings and used them. And of course, if the systematic reviewers carefully looked at the quality and took quality into account, either for selecting papers to be systematically combined or for weighing papers in terms of importance in drawing conclusions, that gives you more confidence than an instance where anything that came up in the search is used in a systematic review. And there may be a reference to the review criteria, the grading systems as they are being used by various well-established organizations, the Agree Collaboration, Campbell, Cochrane, the American Academy of Neurology has criteria that are often used by rehabilitation researchers, and the Agency of Healthcare Research and Quality has been publishing in this area. The next step would be data extraction, on which we have 4 questions. And the first one is, do the authors describe an extraction form and a syllabus? And that is a form onto which to extract data, and a syllabus, the instructions exactly how to do that. And ideally, this form is pilot testing, and the people who do the extracting are trained to make sure that A, the form is satisfactory, the syllabus is satisfactory and provides sufficient clarity, and the people know how to use the form and the syllabus. So there should be mention of a form, the mention of a syllabus or other set of instructions. They may not use the word syllabus, and then a sentence or at least one on practice, training of the people. Why is this so important? Well, it's with data collection in a primary study. If we have several data collectors and everybody does more or less his own thing, the data are probably not even combinable. They certainly are not necessarily reliable, and you wouldn't have much confidence in the bottom line of a primary study like this. So the same holds true for systematic review. There has to be a plan, and the people who are to execute the plan need to be trained in doing so. Once we have all the data together, preferably in something like an evidence table, which is a systematic overview of all studies with their relevant data lined up, we can go on to the qualitative synthesis, on which AQASR offers 6. And number 2 I picked here is the method of data synthesis for aggregating evidence across studies described. Look for statements as to whether the synthesis was qualitative only or combined with meta-analysis. Specifically, if there is no meta-analysis, what methods and criteria were used or will be used if we're still in the protocol to combine the results from various studies and draw conclusions from the joint findings. And why is this important for a systematic method? Well, this goes back to why we generally have much more confidence in a systematic review than in a non-systematic qualitative review of the literature by an expert. It is very easy to be biased if you can selectively quote literature, if you rely on your memory for findings of studies. Systematic reviews tell you to look at all the literature, evaluate it carefully, extract data carefully, and then put it together. And the results presumably is a more complete, more careful, less biased answer. Discussion and recommendation should follow like it does in an old-fashioned primary study, and we have 7 questions to that effect. The first one are the study limitations discussed. For instance, publication bias, strength of the studies, decisions that were made on synthesis, and why they were made the way they were made, or what happened under alternative rules. There may be a specific subsection in the discussion section. Otherwise, there may be a few paragraphs. You may look for such terms as publication bias, selective outcome reporting, attrition bias, funding bias, all terms that indicate that the authors are aware that the literature, the primary literature, is never perfect, has holes, may have biases in itself, and there's only so much a systematic reviewer can do to abolish those problems, but at least he can tell you, the end user, as to what he or she thinks the problems with the primary literature is, and what therefore might be a shortcoming of the conclusions of the systematic review. So there's the awareness of the weaknesses, and an informative discussion of the effect of the weaknesses on findings, of steps taken by the reviewer on findings, should give you more confidence that you can trust the end result. I'm moving on to slide 48, meta-analysis, on which there are 7 questions. Number 1, is it specified how missing values are handled? Is this appropriate? For instance, if you have a systematic review of prognoses and you try to determine what the prognosis is for a particular disorder based on the age diagnosis, the gender of the patient, and let's throw something in, whether or not they are diabetic. You will find studies that gave prognostic information based on age and gender, and you might find another that has information on diabetes and gender, but is missing age. And the more indicators you want to put in your prognostic study, your meta-analysis of factors that determine outcomes, the more likely it is that one or more studies will miss one or more of those things. Okay, how do you handle that? That's an important question, because if you would eliminate every study that misses at least one prognostic element, you probably would throw out most of the studies, which would not be very helpful. The crucial information, number of cases, standard deviations, all that stuff may be missing, but you could have various way of handling it. Omitting the report is one, but sometimes it's legitimate to estimate from other study using conservative values and other things that should be justified and should be justifiable in your eyes. Which brings us to the specific type of studies. Most systematic reviews being published are of intervention studies, and we have 12 questions in that area. Number one, is the intervention and the comparator of interest described in the systematic review clinical question? Do they tell you what they're looking for in terms of specifically the intervention, the treatment, and to what are they comparing it? To placebo, to usual care, to an old standby treatment. It should be carefully described which ones of these is or is not included. And that's, of course, because you, as the user of the systematic review, want to know this, and fairly well up front. If you are using a particular treatment for a problem your clients have, and something new has come on the market, and you want to know, well, it's new, but is it better than what I have been doing for the last 10 years? The systematic review that compares the new intervention with placebo is not going to be much help to you. You want a systematic review that addresses studies that compare the new treatment with the treatment you've been done for this long. And if it doesn't answer those questions, then this particular review is not relevant to your question. Prognostic studies, 6 questions. First one, do the authors define the population of interest, and do they specify the criteria to make sure that all the primary studies involved deal with the same population or a sample from the same population? So here you look for definitions of the population of interest, specific criteria that might have been used by the systematic reviewers, a checklist or other mechanism to make sure that even after 5 years or 10 years there is not so much attrition in the primary studies that they are not any longer much representative of the population at hand. And you need to know this information because you have to determine whether it will generalize to relevant population, patient groups, especially, of course, the group of patients that you are treating. And only that knowledge will allow you to make a determination that, at least in principle, the answers of the systematic review can help you. I will not address questions from the categories diagnostic accuracy studies, in which AQASR has 8 questions, measurement instrument research with 10 questions, and economic evaluations with 7 questions. Be it stressed that all of these are in the instrument as it's on the website that was mentioned at the very beginning of this presentation. So what's the bottom line? Well, there is 56 basic questions to which you should add 6 to 13, depending on the systematic review, is from diagnostic to 13 on interventions, plus an additional 7 if the systematic review handles or uses meta-analysis. So that boils down to 62 to 76 questions. Not all of them are applicable to all reviews. There is a fairly large number that start with the question if the systematic review you're looking at does this and this, then a question is applicable, otherwise you can skip it. But even if it's only 50 questions, it's still a significant investment of your time. Is it worthwhile? We certainly thought so, because we're convinced that many systematic reviews are weak, and the literature has shown people who have looked at systematic reviews that they very often are outdated, unsystematic, not high quality, and sometimes even biased. So for you as a potential user to read them carefully using the checklist and convince yourself that what you are reading, the systematic review, doesn't fall in one of those negative categories, is important. Is it easy? No, especially if you have never taken a course in doing systematic reviewing or have never contributed to a systematic review. Applying AQASR is not that easy. And when we have offered training at ACRM and at the Association of NIDRR grantees, whose name escapes me right now, many people were interested in hearing from us. So for that reason, as Joanne indicated in the beginning, CEDL is planning to put on an online training course with me as the course director and faculty, consisting out of 3 or 4 sessions in the fall of this year. And it would be web-based, and we would go over all the questions in the checklist, and we would have homework assignments for people, and we would discuss the homework, giving people a much better idea as to what the instrument is and how it should be applied, and what the findings are if it's applied to a systematic review that presumably will be selected in consensus by the people who sign up for this course. Dates and times haven't been set. We don't even know yet whether it will be 3 sessions or 4. That probably will depend on how much knowledge people already have. But if you're interested, inquire. And if you go to the next slide, 59, there is the address where you can email to get information on this course, indicate that you're interested, and be put on the list for more information. Even if you don't think that you can spend the time to learn step by step about AQASR, I suggest that you go to the website and get a copy of the entire instrument. As I indicated, it has the questions, but it also has all the what to look for, why to look for it, information on systematic reviewing in general, and then the glossary in the back. So that's it for me today. Thank you for participating. I invite you to give your feedback to today's webcast. Share your thoughts with Joanne as to future webcasts you might want to do, and participate in the community of practice to continue the dialogue. And Joanne, who will come back online right now, will be able to tell you more about that. Joanne?
Well, thank you very much, Marcel. I really appreciate your time in going through the lengthy document. Do you think you have enough time to answer a few questions that we've received?
I can answer a few questions if you have the time.
Okay, I think we have probably about 15 or 20 minutes that we could apply to that. And one question is, at the 60 or 70 plus questions that you described, it does seem to be a long document. Some of the existing instruments out there to evaluate systematic reviews are only 20 or 25 questions, or maybe even less. Why wouldn't these simpler instruments do as well?
That's a good question. Well, for one thing, they cover less. Generally, they do not have the questions we have about applicability. And then most of them, if not all of them, and I would have to go back to look at the 4 or 5 that I'm familiar with, are only focused on systematic reviews of interventions, which indeed are the type that are most common, but I see in the literature more and more systematic reviews of diagnostic questions, of prognostic questions, and I even have seen a few of the economic questions. For checklist items that specifically guide you through that type of questions, AQASR, I think, is the only game in town. And of course, the other checklists may have some suggestions on what to look for or how to answer a question about this was done well, poorly, or not at all. But I think that AQASR, with the look for checklist and with the importance, gives a lot of background to a potential user that is value added. So that's my short answer, why I think people may want to use the long quote-unquote AQASR rather than the shorter existing instruments.
Well, thank you. Another question here is, if we find a systematic review published in a journal, why would I need to assess its quality? Don't the journal's editors do that before they print it?
Uh, yes, it's a peer-reviewed journal. Presumably, systematic review that's submitted for publication has been peer-reviewed by 2 or 3 reviewers selected by the journal. That not necessarily automatically means that it is a good review. For one thing, journal editors are very much aware that systematic reviews are cited more often than other type of papers, and therefore like to publish systematic reviews because it's good for their impact factor. And not necessarily a very good reason, but we know it's a reason that's being used. So even, if the reviewers, the peer reviewers, were not too wild about a systematic review, the editors may not to be too interested in rejecting it, or be very careful how far they push the authors in revising it and improving it. And even if a systematic review is very good, is published in a strong journal, it only accepts quality stuff, we still have the question of applicability. Is this particular systematic review relevant to my particular clinical question? So it may be worthwhile, if nothing else, to use the first 7, I think, AQASR questions to, at the minimum, answer the question, is this relevant to my specific question? If after that you want to rely on the judgment of the editors and the peer reviewers, that is, of course, entirely up to the potential users. Generally, I like to make my own judgments in matters like that.
Right. Well, thank you very much. Another question here. You said that the AQASR is a checklist and not a rating scale. And why can't you make it a rating scale? Couldn't you just rate things, say, 1 point for each item that's completed, or maybe a half a point if it's not fully completed or that you can't tell for sure? Maybe 0 if something is not addressed. Add up all the points and then come up with a number that might let you know, well, if you have so many, it's good. If it's not that high a number, it's not so good?
Yeah, and people have done that, for instance, with the consort checklist for how to write an intervention paper. People have used the checklist of, I think, 23 items and used it to rate the quality of a particular primary research paper describing an intervention. So, it can be done. Is it a good idea to do it? As I indicated in the beginning, not necessarily. I'm afraid, and the task force, when it put this together, was afraid that people would do a quick chase for items, fill in their 1s and 0s, and maybe the half points, add them up, and then think that they knew the quality of this particular systematic review. And we were more interested in seeing that people carefully looked at its entirety. There's a second issue which I referred to as the killing problem. Systematic review may be done very well, but then in the end you find out that in, say, doing the meta-analysis, they made some pretty big blunders in combining the results mathematically, and everything from that point forward is done badly. Well, you could miss one or two items, get a 0 score for them, and still get a very high score on the total AQASR checklist if we were to make one. And you would go around in the mistaken belief that this particular systematic review is a good one. While if you really pay attention and indeed come to the conclusion that the quantitative synthesis makes no sense whatsoever, you would put this thing aside and say, I can't use this information. Is there another systematic review, or should I just read all or some of the primary papers myself and come to my own conclusions?
Okay, well that certainly does make sense. I could see that weighting some of those items might be difficult too. Some of them might be more important than others. And how would you really be able to figure that out?
That's another issue, but we probably could do that by, say, reconvening the task force or other people like that, and have them in, say, a Delphi mechanism come up with ratings for the importance of either the individual items or the individual subsections. But that still means that if we use the rating scale model where you sum up items or sum up subscores, the lethal problem in a particular section may not be enough to sink the entire ship.
Right.
I've often thought that a multiplication model would fit better there, because even if item 1 gets a score, section 1 gets a 90% score, and section 2 gets a 90% score, and section 3 gets a 90% score, if section 4 gets a 0, 0 times 9 times 9 times 9 is still 0.
Right.
But that's a different story.
Well, are you aware of any published or unpublished projects that might have used the AQASR to evaluate systematic reviews?
I am not. And because we weren't smart enough in the beginning to baptize this instrument, and essentially only very recently the label AQASR was applied, and having said it now 20 times during the last 10 minutes, indicates to me that it's not the smoothest abbreviation, but presumably if people used it, they would mention the abbreviation, and then it would be kind of easy to find in the literature or in a web search, because originally this was referred to just as guidelines for the evaluation of systematic reviews or quality and applicability. you would need to do quite some hard work to find those references, and I have never done that hard work, nor have I been contacted, to my recollection, by anybody who said, we've been using that checklist of yours, and it works great. It really helps us.
Well, that would be good to hear that, so we may have to do some follow-up and see if we can find those people out there. But now that we've got this edited version, maybe that's something that we can do in the future.
Okay.
But I think we are just about out of time today, so I wanted to ask if you have any final words for our audience.
No, I have nothing more than, again, suggesting that they have a look on your website, download the entire document, and peruse it. It's in my eyes is very useful for a number of purposes besides the actual use of the checklist.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I really appreciate your taking your time to make this presentation for us, and thank you to everyone for participating today. We hope you also found it very informative. I do want to remind our listeners, as Dr. Dijkers mentioned, we will be following up soon with our online workshop that he will lead to help explain the entire document and checklist in detail and how to apply it. Also, if you have any questions today that we were not able to get to, please send them to us by email and we will be sure and get back to you. We also have a brief online evaluation form and would appreciate your input about today's webcast. The link is on the last page of the PowerPoint file, and everyone who registered will also get an email with a link to the evaluation form. On this final note, I'd like to conclude the webcast with once again a big thank you to Dr. Dijkers from myself, Ann Williams, and all the staff at the KTDRR. We also appreciate the support from NIDR to carry out the webcast and our other activities. We look forward to your participation in our next event. Good afternoon.